Hello, welcome back to my channel. Today I will be doing my April wrap-up. I read a total of 9 books from a wide variety of genres and voices. We have some media propaganda, media literacy, a trashy celebrity memoir, a rare translation from a secretive country, some LGBT stories, and some decolonial texts. So if you're interested, stick around and we will get right into it. The first book I read in the month of April was Copaganda, How Police and Media Manipulate Our News by Alec Karakatsanis. This is about dissecting and analyzing media propaganda in the form of policing and how the media manufacturers consent for more funding for policing, specifically also how the media pushes back against any little bit of police reform that is enacted. And so I'm always interested in learning about how our media shapes us and shapes our ideologies and our political beliefs. So this book is not interested in the more obvious forms of propaganda like conservative media like Fox News or the New York Post, because those are quite obvious. He is more interested in dissecting liberal media propaganda in the form of the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, etc., and how they manufacture consent for more policing. So one of the things that he starts the book off is he talks about how what the media focuses on in terms of crime, there is disproportionate coverage on crime done by lower class people, poor people, crime committed by people reported on every day, versus crime done by the rich and powerful, the elites, is really not given the same equal amount of attention. And so when it is, it's usually like a once in a blue moon breaking story, right? Think of the Epstein files, Abu Ghraib, the war crimes of every U.S. administration, environmental pollution, wage theft, medical malpractice, etc. These are only once in a lifetime stories that are broken, but the stuff happens all the time, and it's just not given the same amount of media coverage as, say, everyday burglaries and robberies and assaults that take place in any given city at any given time. That is one aspect of how he begins the media analysis of this book. The other part of the book is he analyzes the years following the George Floyd protests in the 2020s. Specifically, I think this book came out in like 2023 or actually came out in 2025, and how the media was, on the one hand, able to co-opt and neuter the demands of the movement, and was also able to expand on the belief that violent crime was rising and that the only solution was more policing. And he said, even again, the very simplest, moderate of reforms that are usually championed by progressive prosecutors are often seen as, oh my goodness, these are failures, the crime in this city is out of control. And he analyzes violent crime throughout the years, despite the fact that crime has been consecutively going down since the 1980s. There was a brief, upwards blip in the 2020 because of the pandemic, and then it went down again. And how the media is really able to get liberals and progressives to manufacture their consent for more police. There's a lot of just really insidious ways. And we know too, in terms of crime done by people who are poorer, that this is often motivated by poverty, and that funding government resources, funding the welfare state, funding access to education and outreach programs and healthcare and giving living wages is generally correlates to reducing poverty and therefore crime. But the elites are more interested in pushing the carceral state, pushing the punishment bureaucracy. And this is not just police or police unions or prosecutors, but a lot of companies that are making bank from this. He cites the beginning of the story begins with a jail that was holding people, and this telecommunications company wanted to sell their product to the jail. So the jail effectively, they bought the contract and they banned in-person visits so that people who want to see their relatives can't physically see them anymore. They have to dial in and use the telephone service. So overall, I thought this book was well done. I think it was fairly informative. The only thing is I think that this got a little bit repetitive, and I think that some of his steps towards, he is a civil rights attorney and I think a defense attorney specifically, but some of his steps at the end as to what you can do as a person, I found to be a bit lacking. Get involved with your community, don't read mainstream news. Yeah, I get that, but when you kind of uncover these layers of problems that are so deeply entangled into this massive system, it's overwhelming when you read it. And I often find that sometimes authors' suggestions just can ring a little hollow or just seem insufficient, but I ended up rating it 4 stars. The next book I read was a memoir by someone I had never heard of before, and that was Stripped Down, Unfiltered and Unapologetic by Bunny XO. Now, how did I end up reading this book? Well, my mom got it at the library, at my parents' library, for $2, and she's like, this was on the New York Times. Have you heard of her? And I'm like, no, I don't know who that is. And when I was home for Easter, I ended up reading it, and I don't know why. It's because I didn't have anything else to read. It was a quick read, but this was not, most celebrities, they have ghostwriters, and this was just not a good example of having a good ghostwriter. I think that the way she flits around in this book, her upbringing as the daughter of a mother who abandoned her and being raised by her dad, and then her abusive stepmom, and then being a teenage delinquent and getting into drugs, and then the sex industry, sex work, and then finding her husband who's named Jelly Roll. I literally don't know who any of these people are. I feel it was just, the writing was bad, but it was also someone who's not really probably properly processed their trauma. And there was also just discrepancies. She talks about her mom leaving when she was 3 months old and having black hair, but in the photos in the book, her mother has light brown hair, and she's clearly at least maybe 2 years old at the oldest with her mom. So yeah, there was just really, I'm trying to find an example of really bad writing. There's one part where she says, my 17-year-old self jumped at the opportunity to be with this man. This hot Italian stallion thinks I'm the kitty's titties. I'm in. You need a better ghostwriter, because I've read celebrity memoirs about women who are train wrecks, like Janice Dickinson's celebrity memoir called No Lifeguard on Duty. I still have it. And even though the memoir, I guess, had her tone of voice, very similar of someone else who had a lot of childhood trauma and dealt with addiction, I thought that was just better crafted. The writing was just poor. It was piss poor on this book. So yeah, I gave this 1.5 stars, and it's gonna go in the Little Lending Library. Sorry, but no, not for me. The next book I read was definitely much better, and it is a Korean translation, and it was called Friend, a novel from North Korea by Paek Nam-nyong, translated by Immanuel Kim. So this is the only English translation from North Korea that was obviously state sanctioned, and I found this book quite fascinating, actually. I gave it 3.5 stars. There is definitely a hefty dose of state propaganda in this book that reminded me. I mean, the only other time I've seen it so obvious was Ayn Rand in Atlas Shrugged, which I DNF that. And so, yeah, if you can look past that and just sort of, look at like the heart of the story, I guess. So this was originally published in 1988, and it is a glimpse of how, at least in the late 80s, people in North Korea went about getting a divorce. So this semi-famous opera singer, her name is Sun Hee, she goes to a judge to get a divorce from her factory working husband, and the judge, Jiang Jing-woo, he takes his like vested interest in the case and the couple, and he ends up becoming like a marriage counselor to them almost. Definitely gets like crosses the line and gets entangled into their lives. No, I don't know like what the divorce law is in North Korea. I don't know how much it differs from the late 80s until present. I am assuming there is like no a concept is like, or there wasn't a concept of like no fault divorce there, so there has to be like a really good reason as to why you are getting a divorce. When we're following the judge, he's kind of like the main character. I mean, it's written in third person, but like we also get glimpses of like his home life and his marriage, and his wife is like she's like a botanist, and she sometimes like goes away to this like remote part of like the countryside to like work on her plants, and they keep the plants in the house, and he feels like kind of exasperated by this. And so it's like basically like an examination of the everyday sacrifices that entail in a marriage, after the spark is gone, and how do you adjust to like the day to day, and how do you like adjust your life goals, and how like you're not like an island, like you and your partner are a team, essentially, right? Now, the interesting thing about this book is like the ideology is, everything. There's like a heavy emphasis on like improvement, but in the West, like we would see improvement as like improvement for the individual, and here it is presented as not only like self-improvement for like the good of your family unit, but like for the good of society, for the good of the collective, the good of the party, like all of these things, right? And that is definitely this like socialist realist kind of view. But there was some stuff that was like so like laying it on thick. Like this one line like cracked me up. This one guy was talking about the wife, her opera singing, and he goes, whenever she sings about the nation, I, along with the rest of the audience, fall in love with our country all over again. I was like, stop. I cannot with this. I cannot. So it was interesting. It was an interesting little glimpse, however censored, and I think that like a lot of like defector narratives, I haven't read, but like there was even an article in The Guardian, of all places, about how like they don't really hold up under scrutiny. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting just because it is like the only known English translation of something out of North Korea. So yeah, I would recommend it, and I think it is a nice reminder that no matter what kind of government you're living under, what kind of society or system, we all still, there's still like certain universal human emotions and relationships that all of us go through as just being part of the human condition. The next book I read was a 2026 release, and that was Is This a Cry for Help by Emily Austen. This is my first Emily Austen book, and she normally writes about lesbians, I believe, and their relationships and like their internal world. And this is a book about a lesbian librarian named Darcy, who just had a mental breakdown and is now back at work at the library. And she had a mental breakdown over her ex-boyfriend, Ben, tragically dying in like their 30s. And she hadn't had like really contact with him in the past like 10 plus years, but it's triggered like a lot of memories, and she's like constantly like ruminating and thinking about that time, thinking about how like before she realized she was gay, realized that she, wasn't really in love with him, and there was a weird power imbalance in their relationship and all of that. And so she's back at work and she's adjusting, and in the meantime she is dealing with some angry conservative patrons who are demanding book bans and thinking that a woman in a wig who reads to children is a drag queen, and that they're doing drag queen story hours, and they're outraged that people in the library are allowed to watch pornography, which I did not know until I read this book, that in some libraries in the US that actually is allowed, as long as you don't have your you don't have the audio on. And so she's dealing with this sort of like nipping fascism that is happening at her job, and then also still trying to like navigate her marriage with her wife Joy at home. And it's like a very tender book. There's a darkness to it, but it's written in a way that is rather, I think it's a bit commercial, so it's very, very accessible. It's a quick read, but there's sad moments, and there's also like touching and funny moments as well. I did chuckle at certain things, and it's a really, I think you could say, and I've heard this said about this book before, that it's really like a love letter to libraries and to librarians. And I read this book actually in a day over the weekend. The only thing I think is that I felt sometimes the writing could get a little bit didactic, not the level of the previous book, but there were points where I think like we understood what she was getting at. For instance, there was part where she talks about compulsory heterosexuality, which is what Darcy had with her when she was in her relationship with her boyfriend before she was truly aware. And I think even if you didn't know what that is, you would get that. But then like the author randomly, like the next paragraph, she spells it out, and that annoys me. I see that more and more in books lately, and it was just like, okay, like we get it. We could surmise that if we didn't know. So that was like my only thing. But yeah, I liked this book actually. I would recommend it. I rated it 4 stars. The next book I read was Stag Dance by Torrey Peters. This was really interesting. I don't think I've ever quite read a book that dealt with these topics before, but then again, I don't think there's not like a lot of fiction about the lives of transgender women. So this is a collection of stories. There's 3 short stories, and then there's also a novella, which is the title story. And all of it is concerning like the lives and interiority of trans women or trans feminine people at different stages of their lives. Some of them are pre-transition. So the first short story is this sort of like Black Mirror-esque dystopia where trans women have brought about this gender apocalypse. And I think it from like this like drug or whatever, and everyone basically has to choose. No one can make their own sex hormones anymore, so now you have to inject your own sex hormones, and so essentially everyone now is like choosing their gender. I mean, I thought the concept was really interesting, but this was probably my least favorite story. I don't know, I don't think that like it had like the same heightened emotion as the other stories do. There's a story called The Chaser, which is about these 2 boys. The one is obviously like probably like gonna, you can tell he's like pre-transition, and their illicit love affair. And what goes wrong in that. And there's a very graphic, though, like animal death scene of a pig in this where they were like working at a farm, and it was a bit much. I like don't really like reading that. The title piece, Stag Dance, it's very odd. It is about these lumberjacks in Wisconsin at the turn of the 20th century, and they're all like rather queer and gender bending. And the main character is they're like gonna put on like this ball where some of them present as women, and the main character is this very burly, unattractive man that has always wanted to do this, and he's in competition with this other man that is kind of like the golden boy, and everyone already sort of sees as feminine, and they're vying for like the affection of the head guy. And it was rather, I mean, it was just so odd, but it reminded me a little bit actually of Melissa Faliveno's Hemlock, not just the setting of the Wisconsin woods, but there's even kind of like a similarity with this unknown humanoid creature that is lurking in the background. And then the last story is called The Masker. It takes place in Las Vegas, and it's about this really contentious relationship that exists between transgender women and autogynephilic men. I mean, there's a lot of really interesting themes that deal with like the blurred lines between sexuality and gender identity, the self-loathing of a lot of these characters is palpable, and you can see just like how from every angle, if you are transgender, you are faced with like this outward hostility and repression and violence and betrayal, including even from other trans women. So a lot of this is just deals with like the characters longing for acceptance and validation, and for just from others and from society at large. I think it was well done. I only just wish that like the last story, it ends on a very bleak and disturbing note, like very disturbing mental imagery, the final scene. And I think I didn't really like the collection ending on that note. I don't know. I don't think it really did it justice, but I thought it was solid overall, and I rated it 4 stars. The next book I read was Eyeliner, A Cultural History by Zahra Fatima Hankir. I had this on my TBR for quite a while, and this is a nonfiction book about the history of eyeliner and situating it within its various cultural contexts across different time and places. And as someone who loves eyeliner, I consider it a necessary part. My one product that I need for makeup. I could care less about anything else, but I need eyeliner. I was eager to read this. Also, the author is Lebanese. She's from Lebanon originally. But I was disappointed in this book. I think that it read more of like a series of Refinery 29 articles stitched together. Maybe I've just read like books about like really dense, heavy topics that like really do like deep dives. So my expectations were too high, but I don't know. This just felt like a rather silly pop culture book. And I felt like, I mean, we go from like so many different places in the world. There's like, obviously the Middle East and ancient Egypt and Jordan, and like men who wear eyeliner in Jordan, kohl to protect their eyes, which is still practiced in parts of the desert, to nomads in Chad, to geishas in Japan, to cholas in the southwestern part of the United States, to a specific form of like a cultural dance in the southern state of India that has very elaborate costume makeup. I mean, it on the surface is interesting, but like the summary of each chapter would be as follows. Either the interviewees would say, I wear eyeliner because it is empowering and it connects me to my heritage, or I wear eyeliner because of its transformative power. Like that's basically what you get at the end of each chapter, and it started to feel repetitive. And there were some things in this book that just rubbed me the wrong way. I think that although the author is from South Lebanon, she was educated in the UK, and she lives in, I think, Brooklyn, New York. And I could kind of tell, like, there was times when it felt very Western, and I think it was the section on Iran that rubbed me the wrong way. Like, she interviews a couple women in Iran, but like a good bulk of the chapter, like, space was given to a diaspora woman, an Iranian American, which I think that I don't think diaspora people should really have the same weight as like people living within that country, just because I think we've seen with certain groups that the politics of the diaspora are often quite different than the people who live within that country. And I felt like she presented this very one-sided view of modern Iran that, like, if you're going to talk about the country, you really have to talk about how the West, really the US, but, you know, also the UK, have been engaged in active hybrid warfare against Iran for the past 70 years. And that begins with the 1953 coup. And I mean, this is in the form of sanctions, of encouraging neighboring countries to invade, of assassination of nuclear scientists, of trying to stir up insurrections, of media that is aimed at the citizens, that, you know, tries to get in to get them to think a certain way. Like, all of this stuff, you can't just like leave it out without, like, yeah, that's why they are anti-Western, or the government is. Like, that's why that animosity exists. And, you know, for someone who says they love Edward Said, which she does, it just really lent itself to, I think, a lot of Orientalist tropes. And like the quoting also of people from like the Atlantic Council and the BBC, that rubbed me the wrong way. I think in general, I was more irritated and sensitive about this topic than I would have been otherwise, simply because I see how consent is manufactured for regime change. And yeah, I've just, you know, I would feel differently, I think, if the Iran war hadn't happened. But reading this as this was going on, that specific chapter pissed me off. So yeah, I rated it 2 stars, not just because of that, but like I said, it just was a very shallow read. I mean, I learned some things. I thought there is a chapter on drag queens, and she does focus on one drag queen who's Lebanese, and she talked a little bit like the queer life in Beirut, and I thought that was interesting, honestly, because Beirut is a little more open-minded. While I learned like some things, it just felt kind of like a shallow analysis, so I was just hoping for something more. So 2 stars. The next book I finished in the month of April was, I needed to cleanse myself after that previous book, was The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon, translated from French by Richard Philcox. There's a couple different English translations. I had the one by Richard Philcox, I think was translated in 2004. This is a classic text. This is like a classic decolonial text that was controversial when it came out, and it's still honestly controversial. This is powerful, succinct, and urgent. He does not mince words. This was published in 1961. Frantz Fanon was from Martinique, which I think is still like a French territory or like French department. And he was a psychologist, and he went to Algeria during their War of Independence in the 50s and 60s against the French, who had been there for about like 160 years. And he was treating soldiers, both French and Algerians, and that was what inspired him then later on to not only write this book, but actually take up arms alongside the Algerians in their fight for liberation. And so a lot of this book is a really good analysis of the violent psychological subjugation of colonialism and why the colonized choose armed resistance. And when I read this, I couldn't stop seeing the parallels to modern Palestine. I mean, you could substitute it for any group within the world that was the victim of settler colonialism specifically, or just colonialism in general. The middle half of the book, I rated this 4 stars, only because the middle half of the book does drag a little bit. It was interesting to read this after reading How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney, because he does offer like a fair amount, Fanon, criticism of African countries' political failures post independence, and their corruption of the national parties, and how really is a good segue into neocolonialism in the 21st century. Basically, he absolutely tried some of these, like, rather, he says that this bourgeois replaced the indigenous bourgeois, then replaced the European bourgeois, the European leaders. And I think it is, like I said, like a good segue into neocolonialism in the 21st century. I believe that France still controls the banks of 13 of their former colonies in Africa, which is crazy to think about. But yeah, there's a lot in these subsequent chapters. The last chapter is like the psychological case studies of the people he was analyzing, which was quite interesting. But I think that the first chapter on violence, easily 5 stars. I think that after reading that, like, anything would just pale in comparison. I wanted to list a couple of quotes that I wanted to read. The very same people who had it constantly drummed into them that the only language they understood was that of force now decide to express themselves with force. In fact, the colonist has always shown them the path they should follow to liberation. The colonial regime owes its legitimacy to force, and at no time does it ever endeavor to cover up the nature of things. I think this is required reading for every Western liberal, left liberal that tries to equate the violence of the occupied to the occupier, tries to both sides things. I think that it is still an amazing read after all these years and still very relevant. So I recommend, and I rated it 4 stars. The next book I read was Vineland by Thomas Pynchon. This is, I don't own this is my friend's, or actually her husband's. She lent it to me. And this was recently adapted, very loosely adapted, into a film, one battle after another. So I saw the film, I liked it. I don't think it was like a masterpiece, but I enjoyed it. And so I did want to read the book that was inspired the film. I almost DNF'd this. I have never read Pynchon before, and I knew he was difficult, but I struggled really to grasp this, to like get used to his writing style. It is, I guess he's considered a postmodernist writer, and there's just like super long run-on sentences that can go for like 12 lines, and at times it felt too that the writing was so, like, his satire was like so over the top, beating you over the head. It reminded me a little bit of Tony Tillethamute's Rejection, which I also didn't love, like kind of edgelord humor, and I was like, I don't know if I really want to read this, but it got better. I think maybe I got used to his style, but I also liked the political undercurrent that was in this book, which is why I even wanted to see the movie in the first place. So the heart of the story, which is, you can get, there's a lot going on in here. In the movie too, and in this is about it takes place in the late 60s, and it is about a revolutionary filmmaker who betrays her comrades because she has a thing for an FBI agent, and they enter into this sexual relationship, and she double crosses her people, right? And she leaves her daughter and her husband for this agent. And so there's kind of like this political maneuvering around, but both her husband and daughter have to go into witness protection. But I think in the vein of postmodern literature, I cannot even really say that she is the main character. I'm blanking out on her name. I'm not good with names. In the vein of postmodern literature, there isn't really like a main character. I would say the daughter Prairie is the closest to the main character, but like there's certain sections, not that they're even divided up into sections, but where we closely follow certain characters. And it was interesting to see how this differed from the movie, how they adapted this. It's a very loose adaptation. There is one character, her name is DL. I think it stands for Denise Louise. And you could not tell me, she was split into two people in the film. One was Benicio del Toro's character, but like you could not tell me that this was not the inspiration also for Kill Bill. A white blonde woman that goes to Japan and like becomes a samurai. It just was like, or it's a coincidence, I don't know. But like this book also, which I think is another hallmark of postmodern lit, it has so many different genres within it. It's like martial arts, sci-fi, spaghetti western, musical, hippie drug-fueled psychosis, like just a whole pastiche of genres. The politics, like I said, are probably what kept me engaged, because I do find this period of American history quite fascinating. I think especially in light of everything that's going on in the world right now. And it was very obvious reading this that Pynchon is some sort of leftist. That he was definitely sympathetic to like the 60s revolutionary groups, and in general sympathetic to labor struggles within America, broadly speaking. We go from like talking about the IWW, which was also mentioned in Stag Dance by Torrey Peters, which was like a labor organizing group. They were a bit more radical and they're still around, to the McCarthy era blacklist, to COINTELPRO, to the war on drugs. And it's a reminder that the descent into American fascism did not just begin under Trump. It's been a long time coming. And in this book, he essentially theorizes that it is already here. It is already here in the present is 1984, after Ronald Reagan's re-election. So yeah, it's definitely a book that stuck with me. Would I read anything else by him? I don't know if I want to put my brain through that again. It is very much a California book. I think he captures the setting quite well. There were random asides of like the way sometimes women were portrayed, like that just were like, gave me the ick, which I think is very common when you're reading about, you know, male writers from the mid 20th century and earlier. It's like, okay, you know. But I think I liked it. I think it grew on me. So I rated it 3 stars. Difficult read, but I like to use my brain sometimes every now and then when I read. And then the last book I read, number 9, was How to Commit a Postcolonial Murder by Nina McConigley. This was okay. You know, I rated it 3 stars. I think that the title was a bit of a catfish. You know, after reading Fanon, I was expecting a post-colonial murder, and there is a murder, but I'm not sure how it's post-colonial. The inside flap, because I got the hard copy from my library, I think this was released this year, like January. It says it's about these 2 sisters that take revenge on their uncle. They're gonna commit a post-colonial murder, and they blame these actions, a string of actions, not just their actions, but their uncle's actions, on the British, the colonialism of India, because they are an Indian family. But like, I did not see the through line in this. I knew that this was like, if it's young girls taking revenge on an older male family member, I kind of knew why. You know, there is sexual assault in this book, so trigger warning on that. But yeah, I think that it didn't really, the title just doesn't quite fit the story. And the story, it was fine. it was peppered with like, there would be some chapters that were sort of like peppered with like teenage girl quizzes. And you get to see this glimpse of this family living in Wyoming in the 1980s. They are Indian, and they're actually a biracial family. The dad is white, and he's away working like an oil rig a lot. And then the mom's brother, the uncle, and that family come and live with them. And there's a lot of like politics, sort of like the awareness around being like a brown person in a rural white area, and the only non-white people are the other Indians, the Native Americans, who were pushed there via government policy or, fought back for their land much more recently in history out west than what is, here in the eastern part of the U.S. And, the juxtaposition of like American Indians versus East Indians, it was interesting, but it was rather surface level. It didn't really go anywhere. It was just an acknowledgement. I don't know if the random quizzes really worked for me. I mean, it's like a very quick read that is about a dark subject matter that is set against the backdrop of like the 80s and the pop culture of that time, and like the Challenger explosion and all of that. But I don't know. I just think that the story needed a little more meat on its bones. It didn't quite hit. So I rated it 3 stars. And yeah, that's it. I am losing light, as you can see, but those were all of the 9 books I read in the month of April. Let me know if you've read any of these, or you would like to, or anything that you think I would like that sounds similar. And yeah, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.